Well, here's a bit of a switch up on the shooter scene for the Famicom. This is a port of Capcom's classic 1942. One thing about this game is this is in some ways maybe the first port of like a modern classic arcade game to the Famicom. Most of the other ports were either much older classics like, Pac-Man or Donkey Kong or Burger Time or whatever, or they were ports of more recent but much lesser known games, such as Iki, which we saw earlier in this episode. Also of note, this was the first Capcom game for the Famicom. Capcom was one of a newer generation of video game arcade game developers. They've been around since 1979 and were originally known as Capsule Computers or something along those lines. That's where the name Capcom comes from. Their first game came out in 1984, and this game, which was originally in arcades in 1984, was their first major hit. Capcom would eventually go on to overshadow a lot of the older companies like Namco and had many huge hits, both in arcades like Street Fighter II, as well as in the consoles, games like Resident Evil and Devil May Cry. They're obviously still around and still making some pretty good games. In 1942, the arcade game really injected a lot of new life into the shooter genre. Add a lot of things like, for example, the power-ups you can get. Gives you extra shots, wingmen that'll come and attach themselves to the side of your plane and also give you more firepower. Being able to explode all the enemies on the screen at one time by getting a certain power-up. There's bosses every few levels. Really, this game was pretty influential on later shooters. So it's a real classic and a lot of fun. Unfortunately, this Famicom port is definitely not as good as it could be. This was not ported by Capcom themselves, unfortunately, but rather by a rather infamous company known as Micronix. Micronix is a lot like Toza. They're one of those shadowy phantom developers that other companies use anonymously to develop games, and their games are generally noted as being pretty bad. This game has a pretty bad frame rate and is kind of jerky and not at all smooth playing. Of course, Micronix's bad conversion can't completely ruin the game. It's actually still quite a bit of fun to play, but overall it's quite a disappointment, really, compared especially to the arcade game. We're coming up to the first boss right here. Is actually quite difficult, so this is probably one of the better shooters for the Famicom so far, but certainly not as good as it could be.